Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women in Interdependence panel discussion of the 2022 Global Summit at One Shared World. I am Yasmin Rajab, the co-leader of the events team at One Shared World and a Global Barch Fellow at Columbia University, working on youth and changing issues, joined today by Anik Rahman, a Bangladeshi American lawyer and a leader for gender justice, human rights, and reproductive rights. She has spent most of her career in the nonprofit sector, focused on global gender justice and the rights of women and girls. Thank you for joining us, Anika.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us as well is Barry Freeman, who has worked in international affairs for more than 30 years in a variety of settings with the US government, the NGO community, and now with the United Nations in Kosovo. In all her work, she has sought to advance the voice and agency of marginalized populations and people in vulnerable situations, including women, young people, and non-majority communities. Thank you for joining us, Barry.
Thank you.
And finally, last but definitely not least, is Nicola Armacost, the current mayor of Hastings on Hudson, the city. She has spent her career focused on the economic empowerment of women and girls in developing countries and on addressing climate change and on forging partnerships to make the world a better place.
Thank you for having me.
One Shared World is a citizens' movement. Thank you, Nicola. One Shared World is a citizens' movement focused on the mutual responsibilities of interdependence. Our movement seeks to drive real and meaningful change in practices, structures, systems, and outcomes to ensure tangible progress towards building a safer and better world. So I'd like to ask our speakers today, starting with Anika, what are your thoughts about referencing interdependence?
That's a great question. We live in an interdependent world. None of us can live alone. None of us can be an island, and we live on one planet. So we are in an interdependent world. There's just no question about it. And from my perspective as a feminist and as an advocate for the rights of women and girls, we recognize that we live in this interdependent world, and we focused on the rights of women, because, as you know, there has been substantial and is substantial structural and legal discrimination against women. So I don't use the term interdependence because I'm assuming we understand that we live in an interdependent world. And then we can talk more about what terminology I see that I think harkens and resonates with me and people similarly situated, I guess.
Thank you for that, Anika. Barry, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much. First, I'd really like to salute the work of One Shared World in promoting the concept of interdependence as a framework for global cooperation, particularly at this time. As Anika said, yes, our world, we are interdependent, but think of the challenges that interdependence creates. Interdependence has meant terribly stark inequalities around the world. We saw that through the pandemic. We saw that. We see that today with the spread of the internet, which is an interdependent online space, but it's full of hate speech. It's full of misinformation and fake news. And as interdependent as the world seems to be, we also see the resurgence of nationalism in many parts of the world, dividing communities, promoting sort of us versus them competition and mentalities. And then on top of that, we have the war in Ukraine and what that's meant for the world, and mainly for the people of Ukraine. And then climate change where you have just to small island nations and African countries that are facing extreme existential threats, not of their own making. So that's the downside of interdependence. But I just want to just on climate change, COP27 ended yesterday, and the Secretary General in his concluding remarks made a comment that really made me think about what you all are trying to do. He said the most vital energy source is people power. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. What are your thoughts, Nicola, on this term, interdependence?
Well, I love what both Anika and Barry have said. And, the words interdependence, partnership, inclusivity, allyship, they're all really important words. And in my experience, sometimes we do better at living up to what they mean than at other times. So they're aspirational for us. And in my work locally as mayor, what it means is really doing my best and making sure that our board consults with all members of the community on key issues and mediating if there is disagreement. So it can go from something we can do this kind of work through small things like celebrating diversity in events like Juneteenth, Pride Day, Eid, Yom Kippur, Christmas, condemning hate speech, as Barry mentioned. But we do need to have difficult conversations about things that we're doing in our communities that are making us more connected and things that we're doing that are pulling us apart. And I also think that in exercises that are really that people don't think about that much, planning exercises in municipalities, we need to be including all voices. So for example, on the issue of climate change, it's absolutely imperative that we include youth voices. They're going to be the ones who are dealing with climate change when all of us are long gone. I started a Mayor's Climate Youth Council to do exactly that. And so I think that there are lots of different ways in which we can live up to these words that you've given us, and we all need to do a better job.
Thank you, Nicola. So you mentioned the word allyship. Do you think, according to your life experience, that allyship is working or is it not working? And if you could give us examples of each. As a young person, I personally noticed that it is much easier to live up to to great principles such as allyship and interdependence when it comes to great existential threats such as COVID or climate change. For example, One Shared World is the result of people coming together after COVID and an attempt to really confront the global action problem. And regarding climate change, we can see that youth are understandably the population that is most passionate about climate change and cites climate change as one of the biggest things. But there are also many other areas where we might see that allyship or interdependence is not as prevalent. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, Nicola.
So let me give you one example on the issue of LGBTQ rights. In the US yesterday, there was a killing in a nightclub of people who were just having fun, just dancing with one another. And we absolutely have to condemn, as allies, that kind of activity. And we have to create safe spaces for people in our communities. So if they are different in one way or another, whether it has to do with how they define their gender or their race or their religion, they feel included in the community. And I think in terms of allyship, we all need to spend a lot of time listening and learning and not just asking what good allyship means. So making sure that the way in which we think we're being allies actually works for the people we're trying to be allies of. And sometimes, as I said earlier, it's easy. Hosting a gay pride event in a municipality is much easier than working out the right way to address hate speech. So I think there are lots of different ways to do it. I'm really curious to hear what Anika has to say, because I know she cares very much about this issue. So maybe I'll pass it over to her.
Thanks, Nicola. I was just going to say that the words that resonate for me, and for the reasons that Barry and Nicola mentioned, are allyship and collaboration, and a different approach to a deep and genuine collaboration, because we have been in a situation where there are enormous power differences in the world, right? Between countries and within countries, between marginalized communities and those who are majority. And so to me, it's a deconstruction of sort of what I would call a superficial collaboration, but deep listening, and a new way of approaching global partnerships where there is rising power in the global south, and really listening to the voices of those who are impacted. And so I think it is a profound change in how we talk about collaboration and allyship. And what I'd like to mention, at least from a feminist point of view, is that there is this branch of so-called interdependence feminism espoused by conservatives, which is focused on which is focused on women, family values, and family and religious life. So I think in the feminist women's organizing space, this term has some of those implications. Interdependence, the term of interdependence, not to deny interdependence, but it has been used in by certain more conservative forces. So I am very clear in saying, for myself, that allyship and collaboration to advance the rights of women and girls, and to really hear what those who are most impacted, women and girls in refugee contexts. Barry, you probably have dealt with those issues. They can be different depending on different parts of the world. So even though climate change, which is clearly one of our great crises, as is the crisis of inequality, to be honest, interdependence in the climate sense makes absolute sense, and we talk about an interdependent world, but it is also rife with complexity. And I think the way to cut through that complexity, really, and to find common ground, is to think in terms of allyship and deep collaboration that is both intergenerational, interracial, and crosses socioeconomic lines.
Thank you for that, Anika. I also think that working towards a real sense of allyship and collaboration and all of these great things you mentioned, we have to go through a real discussion regarding privilege and the different nuances of privilege and the different layers of privilege. So you can be privileged in the sense that you are born in a developed country or being born in a less developed country, but from a very high social, let's say, class or affiliation, and all of these intersections make the conversation regarding true interdependence in the feminist sphere a really complex issue, and I would like to acknowledge that. On that note, I'd like to hear from Barry regarding this issue.
Thanks, Yasmin. And then what you just said was actually what I was going to pick up on. And that's that, you know, and I've seen this too many times where discussions or trying to be inclusive and listening to voices of marginalized groups, or in some cases, women's group, youth groups, and you're listening, but then it doesn't translate into anything. It's just, the point is to listen, but it's got to be, no, the point is to then take action. And then I think from that point of privilege, you know, those of us who have been raised with privilege and do have more voice or have the capacity to use our voices, we have a real responsibility to give voice, to help others raise their voices and then translate that into action. I think there's, and you see it again, I'll just go back to COP27. There were so many young people there, and with really raising their voices, you know, and yet at the end of COP27, I think we can all say it's very much a mixed bag in terms of results, because of the privileged countries who are the big polluters, and, you know, kind of holding back on doing, making the commitments that need to be made. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. And so, on that note, where do you think we can improve this commitment? Where do you think we can take real action towards ensuring allyship across generations, or dare we say global cooperation? Nicola.
So I'm really delighted that you asked that question, and you know, the the issue of intergenerational partnerships has been critical all of my life, and sometimes what it means is implementing lessons that we've learned from our foremothers and being grateful for how they paved the way for where we are as women and as women leaders. And sometimes it's about actually taking a firm stand to change what earlier generations have put in place. And that's what I think we're seeing younger generations doing in terms of climate change. I really like the point that that Barry was making earlier about responsibility. I think this is a moment in time where taking responsibility is key. One of the things that we did in our small municipality just north of New York is to take on and to make a pledge to address our fair share commitment on reducing emissions. So not 30%, not 40%, not even 50%. For us, that's 67% emissions reduction, which is actually the level that all developed countries should be, polluting countries should be taking on. And so kind of making that notion of taking responsibility very, very palpable, very real, very local, very actionable. I think that's actually part of our responsibility. And then what we do is, and in cooperation with, in consultation with the youth who will inherit this world. So I think it's a really important word to add in to all those lovely words that you had earlier on, however they are interpreted. It's responsibility is a deep, deep part of allyship, I think.
Thank you, Nicola. Anika, what are your thoughts on this subject?
I completely agree with what Barry and Nicola said in terms of responsibility. I think that the interdependence piece that we've been talking about is so clear with climate change and the recent COP meeting. I really appreciate and am profoundly grateful that younger generations are being so vocal on climate and pushing governments and saying the kinds of things that have needed to be said and have not often been said. What I would love to also see in an intergenerational approach is that, and this is happening in some parts of the world, an equal commitment and profound change in the social structure so that women and girls can also advance. And so I see this need intergenerationally to take what I would call an intersectional approach, that who is hurt most by climate? It's women and girls. And I think that women and girls in their own right need to be dealt with fairly, equitably, and get justice. So it's not just to address climate change, but it is because we are inherently equal human beings and we all have equal dignity and we are entitled to justice. And that justice actually will enable us to solve many of the world's problems, including inequality, including climate change. So I am both appreciative of the crisis, of course, and profoundly committed and have worked on climate crisis issues at the same time that I see that there's half the world's people who need justice, equity, and equality.
Thank you, Anika. I agree with what you just mentioned, especially the importance of having an intersectional approach towards these issues, especially issues such as like climate and inequality. And I was wondering about your thoughts on how do you see things progressing moving forward? We know that the climate crisis has really put a, let's say, clock on everything, and we feel the sense of urgency. And do you see this as perhaps a a factor that could facilitate working across generations, whether that's for women or global generations? Barry, what are your thoughts?
Sorry, the screen just went out. Can you just really quickly repeat that? I thought I was losing you all.
Yes, of course, no problem. I was just wondering, what were your thoughts on the eventual progression and the future of working across generations, whether that's for women or for people in general, and how the climate, for instance, has really added the sense of urgency to these conversations?
Well, I think, when we talk about interdependence, we're talking about sort of the whole ecosystem, right? So I think that's whether it's among women, young people, generations, I think all of that comes in to play. But I think what I would say, and I'm very conscious that we have an elected official with us here, Nicole. But I think, what I see in many parts of the world and in the United States too is, kind of a malaise with politics. And that's really dangerous, because politicians are the ones who are making big decisions about how money is spent on policies. And so I think that this interdependent movement, allyship, needs to also really be strategic in advocacy, in making noise, in visit, whether it's in the United States, visiting the member of Congress or visiting the mayor. But I think to really connect what needs to be done with the people who are in the decision-making seats that can change that. And then, of course, in this world of allyship, helping to provide platforms, I would say, particularly for young people, particularly for young women, to get into politics themselves.
I would really love to
Thank you for
respond.
that,
Thank you
Barry.
for asking, Yasmin. I would love to respond because coincidentally, this last week, I had a group of daisies. I don't know if you know who they are. They're the sort of most junior brownies. So they were 6 and they wanted to know about, they were studying democracy. And so they wanted to know about democracy in our village. And so I invited them into Village Hall and I let them each be the mayor and trustees. And they all wanted to be the mayor and they all wanted to be the decision makers. And what we did was we went through a kind of mock board process, decision-making process. I gave them an idea and they debated it. And I have to tell you, I was so inspired. These were 6-year-old girls. They had the pros, they had the cons. They were very formal. They made the decisions. It was beyond adorable because they were so smart and they were so engaged and they knew what the issues were that mattered to them as young people in the community. And so I have such incredible hope for us with these young people who are in these roles. And they were not at all afraid of speaking to the mayor and telling the mayor what they thought the mayor should be doing and in the village, whether it related to having a dog park or a skate park or or sidewalks along a particular street, whatever the issues were. And on the issue of climate change, our younger generation, so the youth council that I started, I think the youngest member is 10 and the oldest are 17, 18. And they have educated me about so many things. I had no idea that there was an app which you could use to repurpose food in the community. They're already working with restaurants on that. So, there are things that we're doing where maybe we're in a better position to put geothermal into certain buildings, but they're in an excellent position to help us reduce waste. So I think these collaborations can manifest themselves in so many different ways. We can learn from younger people. We can learn from our seniors who are expert gardeners and who know how to compost and have been composting, for since time immemorial, and we can learn from the young people. So I'm very hopeful. Annika, over to you.
Well, Nicole, I was just going to follow up when you were talking about learning from, these wonderful young people you interacted with. So I think that the intergenerational piece is critical because there are some mistakes that our generation made. We have to accept that. I think I was talking about the fact that I've lived through and seen rising inequality in this world. I mean, economic inequality, the number of billionaires and the kind of wealth in the 0.001% has increased so incredibly, while poverty reduction has occurred. And yet there's this enormous inequality that occurred within my lifetime. Now, I think that that means our generation has to take some responsibility. That we didn't sufficiently create a more equitable structure that now, in an intergenerational approach has to be addressed. The other phenomenon I've seen in the last 10, 15 years is with has been the rise of authoritarianism, rise of right-wing politics in a way that was unthinkable 15, 20 years ago. Now, again, I would say that the generations who were quote unquote in power, I don't know whether I ever felt that empowered, have to take responsibility. And now we have to be part of the movement to solve the very problems that we were somehow a part of. You certainly can't talk about a young person being at all a part of that system that created these massive problems. And of course, climate change with, this go consumption, and the emission of carbon. I mean, how did that happen? Because it was a so-called growth model of economic development that said, consume more, use more, right? And this is where it's landed us. And maybe that also was part of why these vast inequalities have occurred. And I don't know how to explain. Somehow all that is linked to the rise of the right around the world. That is in opposition to many of the topics that we're talking about. But I do think young people also have the ability to innovate. You are the generation that were born into this socially connected, platformed world. And while it causes a lot of problems every morning, and now I see these things on Twitter, which make me just, what can I say, cringe, beyond cringe. And we've got to figure out a solution to that too, right?
Well, I have to say, I think you're super brave to
Thank
go
you,
on
Anika.
Twitter and Facebook, which I'm allergic to personally. So that is a whole separate issue that has I think exacerbated some of the inequalities that you're talking about in terms of access to the ability to express oneself. Groups are so marginalized in that world, in the world of social media. So maybe I'm an old folk, but I find them generally unhelpful platforms versus helpful platforms.
I think that's interesting, Nicola, because in our younger quote unquote generation, having or using social media feels sometimes not as much like a choice, but more as an obligation. I've personally tried to stay off of social media for the longest time, but it was, if I may use the term, a social suicide. You cannot, in this day and age, not have Instagram, WhatsApp, all of these, Facebook, all of these social media platforms. I can give a very small example from my life in Tunisia. Facebook groups were actually used in school to disseminate information from teachers to students, not just informally between the students. And so social media has transformed itself to become something more as a just a part of life rather than just a tool that you can opt to choose or not to choose. And I think that it plays a very big role in helping or not helping create these movements of global cooperation. Because on the one hand, we have these echo chambers with social media really putting people in small boxes and just disseminating the same ideas and reflecting back their same ideas to them. While also we've seen amazing initiatives come out of social media and of young people, especially using social media to drive real and effective change. So I do think that it's an interesting difference between the generations here. And I'd like to hear from Anika on this issue.
I think you're right that social media has both the ability to mobilize mobilize. I mean, it was used in Egypt and a lot of the pro-democracy movements. And, you saw governments actually shut down social media. And whenever governments want to censor, they shut down social media in their countries. It's happened all around the world, right? So it obviously has enormous power. However, I asked to also deconstruct who owns that power and who's controlling the platforms. And if there isn't a better moment to look at that when Twitter changes hands, and it was a platform that was used around the world, right, for both good, I would say, and bad. So it's a neutral, I mean, we thought of it as a neutral content provider, but clearly what recent events show is that it's not so neutral anymore. And the power, as you know, most of the tech companies are sitting in certain countries, and the United States and in China, and then being used by more significant world powers. So I don't know what that means for the general global South, and I don't know what that means about organizing socially to and to build a kind of allyship and collaboration that we're talking about here, right? That it's a tool that has to be used, I guess, strategically and thoughtfully, but knowing who controls those tools in a way too. So it's so complicated that I'm not sure that we've learned to deconstruct it, but I know it reflects power and privilege, right? The very things that Barry and Nicola were talking about. I'd love to hear Barry's thoughts on this, because I'm sure you have a lot to say, Barry.
Well, no, I just share. I think I'm a little bit in between, because on the one hand, I also got off Facebook, but Twitter, some of those other platforms, you've got to stay on them. But I think in what you said, Yasmin, about your generation, I mean, this is just part of your life. But I think whether it's the development of codes of conduct on social media, or of standards of a better way of managing and providing governance over the internet. And I know we're not there. I know there are a lot of efforts, or the UN leads an effort on this, but it's very hard because these companies are in private hands. I mean, just again, looking at what's happening with Twitter today, it's a little bit scary. So we know that, this is part of our world, but how to use it better. I think it's really important for people to call out misinformation and fake news on the internet, and to hold people accountable for what they say. But I think it's a really, really tough one. And who would have thought when the internet was created, we really thought it was going to unite us all, and instead it's divided us.
Thank you, Barry. I'd like to pose our final question for this conversation today. And I'm reflecting my age a little bit in this question, so I hope you'll bear with me. So if you were a young woman starting out today, wanting to play a role in creating a better world, what will your advice be to yourself? Nicola, would you like to start?
Well, I think it would probably be the same advice I would have given myself when I was actually your age, Yasmin, which is work out what you really care about. What is it that you care about? Is it fighting for literacy? Is it women's rights? Is it gay rights? Is it climate change? And work out what it is that you feel, what you think, and then identify people whose minds that you can change. So whether it's your mayor, whether it's your congressperson, whether it's someone in local government, whether it's your teachers in your school, that you want them to do something different, and go and tell them, talk to them. And you would be surprised. If you don't ask, you definitely won't get anything. So ask for the things that you think are important, and find other people who are allies who can support you, so you feel less isolated, and act and believe in your agency, because you really have it. You're an agent of change if you're a young woman in the world today.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, Nicola. I will be sure to take note and try my best to go in that direction personally. Anika, would you like to respond as well with some words of wisdom and advice?
Yes. I'd like to say that the most important thing I would tell everybody, including a younger version of myself, is keep the fight going. That our voices must be heard no matter what the challenges, and never, never be discouraged, because it is I believe, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice, but it will only bend if we speak up for justice. And I think it's really important to realize that this is social and political change at the level that we want when we're talking about equality or the climate crisis is a very long-term movement. It is decades and generations. And so it's really important to hold that perspective, to understand that each of us has agency, but each of us singularly is most not likely to make the change. It's all of us as a wave that have to rise. And so to both maintain one's agency and power and belief in oneself, but also realize that it is all of us collectively coming together. That's the allyship, the collaboration that will ultimately, move the arc of history towards justice.
Thank you, Anika. I can already see the image of the wave rising up in my mind's eye. Barry, what would you advise young women and yourself, for an instance, if you were starting out today?
Well, I think I would mostly just say be bold and be brave and get out there in the world and get to know it and understand it and listen to people. And then just picking up on, Nicole, you mentioned you had a group of daisies who came to visit you. I was a lifelong Girl Scout, and I actually co-lead a troop, a Girl Scout troop here in Kosovo of cadets who are middle school girls. And they are so, full of energy and answers and really have very strong ideas about the world. But somewhere along the line, I think it's something that we all have to look out for and help, is that so many girls and women hit a point, because most of us still live in patriarchal societies, as insidious as some of them can be, and girls' voices start becoming muter, and they get lost. And I think that it's just so important to keep sort of sussing out the kind of the practices, whether it's mansplaining or any of that makes women feel smaller and makes them feel that their voices don't count as much as men's voices. I think that's just really, really critical. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barry. On that note, we will be ending our conversation today. Thank you so much, Anika, Nicola, and Barry, for being with us today. And thank you to all of the people who are listening to this conversation right now. Thank you for tuning in into our One Shared World Global Interdependence Global Summit and this conversation on women and interdependence. Thank you for your participation and thank you for your attention.